What happens when the images in your mind start showing up on a screen and you had nothing to do with filming them? For one television journalist, fantasy stops being a private escape and becomes a public nightmare. Greetings, schools, and welcome to a dive into horror television. Tonight we're diving into Studio 3X from The Hitchhiker. We open to a raging protest outside of a film studio. Doug hosts a controversial show where he showcases taboo social issues. Inside, Doug is picking out which take to use for his show. The angry crowd is outside due to murders that were inspired by an episode he did on Satanism. This new episode he's doing is based on violent sex acts and porn. Do violent acts on the screen cause people to commit violent acts in real life? A question as old as the television itself. Doug and his partner are about to leave, and Doug insists that they go out the front door instead of avoiding the circus. Once they're in the limo, they start making out. We cut to Doug making love, and he has her arms tied to the bed, and it cuts to another woman in shackles with tons of kink items displayed on the walls behind them. The woman lets out a blood-curdling scream, and then he wakes up. That's a strange dream. Later on, we watch Doug on his show, introducing Studio 3X and its leader, Alexandra. He enters the studio that makes the scandalous adult movies. He wants to tape the video in the room where they were shooting. He finds a whip and all kinds of wacky toys in there. There's a cage, chains hanging from the ceiling, and even shackles like in his dream. He meets Alexandra, whom he's going to interview for his program. The interview is a weird one, but the executives liked it. They talk about the power in the airwaves. TV broadcasts one wave that leads to the next wave and the wave after that. Without Doug, Alexandra claims she wouldn't even be here. She says it's not only her messages that are transmitted, it's men like him too. That's a weird conversation, but we'll circle back to it later. Doug goes back into the crowd of protesters like a madman. That night his partner wants to make love, but Doug is completely zoned out. Later, they wake up to something strange on the TV. A woman is lying lifeless in shackles in the cage from Studio 3X. Doug looks confused and scared in the video. He says that's not real. He doesn't know how the video exists. He was never in that situation, except in his dream. He smashes the TV onto the ground. He suspects it's the protesters who made the video to scare or blackmail him. He decides to head over to Studio 3X. He convinces the security guard to let him in by pretending he's there for tonight's shoot. He walks through the studio, and when someone notices he's not supposed to be there, he confronts Doug and tells him to leave. Doug headbutts the man, and he falls to the ground. Then Doug runs inside the set and locks the door. He goes over to the cage, and Alexandra is cleaning up. He wants to know what kind of stunt she's pulling, and accuses her of being in with the protesters. She doesn't know what he's implying. He thinks that the video he saw was an actor in makeup pretending to be him. She knows that he dreamt it first. He grabs her by the neck. She starts kissing him and lies down on the table. She tells him to take her. She puts her hands in the shackles and then starts laughing at him. He stabs her with one of the pointiest sex toys in the world. Her death was recorded, and she let out one final scream. The security guards bust down the door, and he's handcuffed right away. We flash forward to Doug watching the tape from an interrogation room. He's gone completely nutso. Ironically, he's talking to a reporter. He scares her by lunging forward. He says he's protected from the devil's eye, and he has a forehead tattoo now. We cut to Alexandra on a wall of televisions. They were watching his interview. So begins the next wave. Studio 3X is fundamentally about responsibility, specifically the moral and psychological responsibility that comes with controlling platforms of mass communication. Doug positions himself as a provocateur that merely asks questions, but the episode steadily dismantles that neutrality. His show frames taboo subjects as cultural experiments rather than human realities, allowing him to disavow consequences when violence follows. The protests outside the studio are not simply reactionary mobs. They represent society pushing back against a media figure who refuses to acknowledge that representation, repetition, and spectacle shape behavior. Since I studied mass communication in college, I have a lot to say about this episode from a media theorist perspective. From a cultivation theory perspective popularized by George Gerbner, the episode aligns closely with the idea that long-term exposure to violent and extreme imagery reshapes a viewer's sense of what is normal, possible, or acceptable. control. Doug insists that he is merely presenting material, not endorsing it, but his dreams, fantasies, and eventual actions demonstrate how repeated immersion erodes psychic distance. Gerbner argued that television doesn't directly cause violence in a mechanical way. Instead, it cultivates a worldview in which violence feels familiar and actionable. Doug becomes the ultimate cultivated viewer of his own programming. Social learning theorists like Albert Bandura would focus on modeling and identification. Doug's show legitimizes transgression by framing it as inquiry. Alexandra explicitly tells him that without men like him, her studio wouldn't exist. The episode suggests that when authority figures present violent or degrading behavior without moral framing, audiences may interpret it as permissible or even admirable. Importantly, Doug himself becomes the learner. He rehearses the imagery mentally in his dreams, emotionally with sexual arousal, and finally behaviorally with murder. This mirrors Bandura's claim that observation, rehearsal, and reinforcement form a feedback loop. The episode also critiques the media effects panic model, the idea that content alone directly causes violence. The protesters believe Doug's show caused murders, but the narrative complicates that claim. Violence does not erupt randomly across society. It concentrates in Doug himself, the person most embedded in the production, curation, and repetition of the imagery. This aligns with uses and gratifications theory, which argues that audiences actively interpret media based on existing desires and psychological structures. Doug was already drawn to control, transgression, and power. The media didn't implant violence into a neutral subject. It amplified what was already there. Marshall McLuhan's famous claim that the medium is the message is almost directly quoted in Alexandra's wave metaphor. The episode suggests that the form of television, its repetition, intimacy, and sensory authority is more influential than any single image. The problem is not just pornographic violence, but the logic of broadcasting itself. Once something is transmitted, it invites imitation, escalation, and mutation. Doug does not simply watch violence, he lives inside a mediated feedback loop where dreams, scenes, and reality are indistinguishable. Marshall McLuhan is one of the most useful thinkers for understanding Studio 3X because the episode is less concerned with what Doug shows on television than with what television itself does to perception, responsibility, and desire. McLuhan's most famous claim, the medium is the message, does not mean that content is irrelevant. It means that the form of medium reshapes human behavior more profoundly than any individual program. In Studio 3X, Doug believes the danger lies in controversial subjects like Satanism or violent pornography. McLuhan would argue that the real danger is television's power to collapse distance between viewer and image, thought and action, fantasy and reality. Television, for McLuhan, is a cool medium. It invites participation rather than passive reception. Viewers don't watch, they fill in gaps emotionally and imaginatively. Doug's dreams are the clearest expression of this. He does not consciously plan violence, yet the imagery he curates seeps into his unconscious and reorganizes it. The shackles and cages appear first as broadcast material, then as dreams, and finally his lived space. McLuhan would say the medium has rewired Doug's sensory world long before he commits any act. The episode also dramatizes McLuhan's idea that electronic media create total environments rather than isolated messages. Alexandra's speech about waves is essentially McLuhan in narrative form. One broadcast does not end when the show is over, it triggers new responses, new reproductions, new intensifications. Doug's program legitimizes extremity. Studio 3X escalates it. Doug internalizes it. Violence is not copied directly. It emerges from a saturated environment where representation is constant and immersive. Importantly, McLuhan would not argue that television causes violence in a simple sense. He would say it reshapes human nervous systems, accelerating feedback between image, desire, and action. Doug is not corrupted by a single program. He is absorbed into a mediated rhythm where thought happens at the speed of transmission. By the time reality asserts itself, it already looks like television. Seen through McLuhan, Studio 3X is a warning about media power that bypasses morality altogether. The danger is not immoral content, but a medium that erodes reflection, distance, and accountability. When everything becomes immediate, sensational, and endlessly reproducible, violence no longer feels exceptional. It feels inevitable. Taken together, mass media theorists would likely say Studio 3X rejects the question, does violent TV cause violence, is too blunt. Instead, it proposes a more disturbing thesis. Media ecosystems create conditions where violence becomes thinkable, rehearsable, and eventually livable for those most deeply embedded in them. The episode condemns neither media nor viewers in isolation, but the fantasy that anyone, especially powerful broadcasters, can stand outside the consequences of the images they circulate. Ultimately, Studio 3X argues that media does not merely reflect culture, it metabolizes it. When violence, degradation, and transgression are repeatedly framed as intellectual exercises or edgy entertainment, they do not stay symbolic. They move inward, become normalized, and eventually demand enactment. The closing suggestion of the next wave is not about copycats alone. It is about how systems of spectacle reproduce themselves through people who believe they are above consequence. The director of this episode directed 5 other episodes of 80s Twilight Zone. The writer was Jeremy Lipp, who wrote 16 other episodes of The Hitchhiker. Perry King played Doug, and he was in The Day After Tomorrow. The actress who played Alexandra was also in the 90s Outer Limits and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. The acting and directing was well done, but the writing could have definitely used some work to create a clearer narrative. This one struggled to send a coherent message. However, what I did gather from it I liked a lot. I'll rate this one a 7.5 out of 10 for The Hitchhiker. I'd recommend giving it a watch through. Let me know what episode of The Hitchhiker you want to see covered next, and until next time, remember to be well and stay spooky.